My talk today is entitled Political Economy of Africa-India Relations, Remaking of a South-South Alliance. This presentation is premised on one broad question: what does the emergence of India mean for Africa economically and politically? I'm looking at two specific aspects of this broad question. Firstly, how has India's engagement with Africa changed in the contemporary political economy? And secondly, is this leading to a new or renewed South-South alliance? The conceptual framework for this analysis draws from two different streams of understanding of this relationship. The more popular trajectory of Africa-India relations is focused on the history of colonization in Africa and India, as well as the post-colonial challenges of social, economic, and political development. However, there is a less popular stream of scholarship, which is of equal importance here, whose examples can be found in the works of Andre Frank. Global Economy in the Asian Age, for instance, posits that the global economy was centered around China until 1800 AD, and that the main economic players of these two millennia were China, India, and Japan, assisted by Russia, Persia, and the Ottoman Empire. A well-established Afro-Asian capitalist economy and trade remained the greater part of world economy until the threshold of the Industrial Revolution. Western Europe was able to participate in it only belatedly, and that too only by extracting precious metals from the Western Hemisphere, particularly through the conquest of the Americas and exploitation of its silver deposits. Kenneth Pomeranz is another exponent of similar arguments. In his great divergence, China, Europe, and the making of the modern world economy, he explains how Western European societies made the leap into industrialization and world domination. He rebuts prior explanations of European success, demonstrating that there was little difference in all the important variables between China, Japan, and Western Europe. Indeed, in some respects, 18th century China may have had freer labor and markets than 18th century Europe. The uniquely and specifically European feature was the existence of state-sponsored and directed overseas expansion as a function of dynastic state competition within Europe, which was a factor absent in China. The actual beginning of industrialization is attributed by Pomeranz to the availability of accessible coal mining in Britain and the need for better water pumps, leading to the application of steam technology. Pomeranz takes particular pains to attack the triumphant notion that free markets lead inexorably to modernization. For Pomeranz, European capitalism is a key to development of industrialization, but only a very particular form of capitalism unique to Europe. This is the state-sponsored or directed capitalism that drove overseas expansion. This peculiar form of capitalism, not the untrammeled free market, became the key to European imperialism and colonialism and the development of key capitalist institutions such as joint stock companies. Also, the success of this peculiar capitalism was contingent on a series of external factors beyond Europe's control. For instance, access to coerced labor made possible by the existence of slavery in Africa, conquest of the Western Hemisphere made possible by the epidemiological advantages of Europeans, and the establishment of trans-global trading networks created by the thirst of China for American silver. At times a bit rhetorical and a bit dense, however, the analysis of Frank and Pomeranz offer useful correctives to the prevailing Eurocentric economic historical timelines and the propensity to not look beyond Europe for patterns, trends, models, and even histories. Secondly, their work can be seen as leading to an expansion of the geographical focus of the Kondratiev waves, or K waves. K waves are defined as a pattern of long-term regularity in the behavior of the leading economies, which is characteristic of structural changes in the modern world economy. Some 60 years in length, it consists of an alternation of periods of high sectoral growth with others, start of periods of slower growth. The study of this pattern helps to trace the evolution of the world economy and aids in political economic predictions. Nikolai Kondratiev a Russian economist writing in the 1920s, did statistical work on the behavior of prices and some output series for the United States and Britain from 1789 to 1926, which led him to conclude that the existence of these long waves was very probable. Kondratiev's theories documented in the 1920s were validated by the Depression less than 10 years later. He saw the capitalist world economy as evolving and self-correcting, and by implication, he denied the notion of an approaching collapse of capitalism, then current among Marxist economists. Of course, this in part explains his execution by Stalin's firing squad. In the 1930s, Joseph Schumpeter endorsed this concept and named the pattern the Kondratiev, a name that has since been attached to this phenomenon, even as its existence remains in contention in the years after, remained in contention in the years after 1945. Neoclassical economists have remained wary of it, and it was only in the 1970s, as the post-World War II expansion slowed down once again, that attention was drawn to it, and new research, especially on innovation, moved the subject matter forward in an important manner. Economic historians have applied the K-waves to study the structure of economy at different stages of world history, to explain the succession of hegemonic states in the West, why a certain state becomes a hegemony, and why others fail. Apparently innocent, these questions in recent scholarship have been covertly concerned with the preservation of US supremacy, how to maintain and prolong it, who were the possible challenges, and when and where could a clash emerge. In other words, the analysis of Frank and Pomeranz allows us to look beyond Europe and the US to seek answers regarding the so-called changing world order by looking at the longer arm or longer cycle of history beyond the Industrial Revolution. So what is happening now that vindicates their un-European focus? Some forecasts predict, and I'm sure you'll hear a lot about that in the next talk, that Chinese economy could outpace the US between 2013 and 2049. 4 out of the 5 largest currency deposits are already in East Asia: Japan, China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. While US current account balance deficit is at $668 billion, and EU current account balance deficit is at something like $20 billion, Japan, Russia, and China have the largest surpluses. 9 out of the 10 largest harbors in the world are East Asian, leaving Rotterdam as the only exception. 70% of world's software production is happening in India. Most of the largest GDP annual growths are in East, Southeast, and South Asia. So yes, economically, this might well be the Asian century. But where does India fit in this scenario? Where do we begin with India? I think the most useful, if confounding starting point is the truism that for every generalization about India, the opposite is equally true. I'll give you some examples of that. India is the world's 4th largest economy after the US, China, and Japan in terms of purchasing power parity. But in terms of Human Development Index, it ranks 127 out of 175 countries. The size of the Indian middle class is estimated at 400 million strong and growing, perhaps the largest in the world. But people living below the poverty line is also perhaps the largest in the world at 250 million. India has experienced the miraculous survival and expansion of democracy, but there's also caste politics, regionalism, ethnic insurgency. Throughout its 6,000 years of patriarchal history, the Indian civilization has produced many women of substance and power. However, female infanticide, dowry, and sati remain modern realities. Starting from a rate of 1% in 1947, India has achieved 70% rate of literacy. However, 300 million still remain illiterate, mostly women. India is also a secular country with the largest number of religions and faiths, but religious strife and fundamentalism are also a fact of life in India. These are not even proper vignettes of the landmine of contradictions that make up India. Unfortunately, this long list of contradictions extends into India's foreign policy, which has vacillated between the lofty ideals of non-alignment to extreme expressions of nationalism. In light of all this, it is not easy to answer the questions: to what extent is India a beneficiary or victim of economic globalization, or whether it is an emerging global power or an emerging client state of the United States. Like everything else, perhaps the answer lies somewhere in between these extreme conceptions. In my opinion, India politically is an emerging middle power which is flexing its refurbished economic muscles in the region and beyond. India's interaction with Africa in the contemporary political economy provides some proof for this assertion. So let's now turn our attention to Africa and India. The African continent comprises of 61 territories with shared histories, identities, and closely tied economies, carved out rather arbitrarily by former colonizers. In the post-war era, Africa-India relationship was driven by the shared historical experience of colonization and its concomitant political, social, and economic problems. During the Cold War era, the non-aligned status espoused by India and a significant number of African